This podcast is designed to assist faculty members in maximising their chances of successfully applying for a consultant post. I'm Ellis Friedman, Faculty Registrar and an experienced faculty assessor, and I'm joined on this podcast by...
Hi, I'm Fatai Ogunlayi, and I'm a recent consultant appointee in London.
Hi, my name is Merla, and I am a recent consultant appointee who gained from my experience of faculty assessor feedback.
Hi, I'm Aimee Stimpson. I'm the Faculty Assistant Registrar, and I'm also an experienced assessor with the faculty on AAC panels. Thanks.
So my first question is, how should you prepare for an interview?
Thank you, Ellis. And I guess we can perhaps look at this in three parts. One is the pre-interview stage itself, or your pre-application, making sure that those applications address all the key elements in the post as advertised, demonstrating, and this bit is easy to overlook, demonstrating how you've met the inclusion criteria for GMC or UK Public Health Register registration. And don't forget to spell check the application. You might be tempted to just do that in a little bit of a rush, but don't forget to spell check the application. So that's the application in itself. The next stage is preparing for the interview. I always say, if possible, visit the organization that you're going in to interview. If not, then call in to speak to maybe the Director of Public Health, if it's a local authority, the DPH, or talk to other people who might have worked in the organization, who might have some experience, who might be able to give you some insight. The key thing is to try to develop your local knowledge. You can also do this by reading some key documents. I certainly find it helpful reading the recent DPH report, where that's available online. The health and well-being strategy will give you a really good sense of the direction of the organization, of the public health team. If they've got a public health observatory, have a look in there. GSNA, if there's an organization that's based in the mayoral town, city, then reading that. Have a look at fingertips. There's wealth of information on there that can help you prepare. And then I also find it helpful to know who is going to be on the panel, because it gives you a sense of the type of questions you might get. And it also allows you to prepare some of the questions you might want to ask. I, in my interview, wasn't told who was going to be on my panel, and I put the request in. I said, I would like to know who's on the panel, please. And that information was provided. And through that, I was able to get a sense of which direction they might want to take this. And it just allows you to prepare yourself to be able to build rapport with those individuals. As you get closer to the day itself, it's always worth thinking about your non-verbal communication skills. We say a lot with our body language that we might not be aware of. If you're somebody that doesn't quite smile often, I'm not saying you have to be grinning all the way through, but it might just be helpful being aware of that and how to make sure that you're conveying that across, and you're making eye contact, you're smiling, you're showing them that you are engaged and you're present in the moment. If it's an online interview, then it's really worth just checking that your equipment works, and you can put stuff on mute when needed. You can turn yourself back off mute if you need to. Those basic stuff really help. And then moving on to the content of the interview itself, I can't say this enough: practice, practice, practice for those questions. For some registrars in particular, it will be the first time in several years that they are having to do an interview. I know for me, it was half a decade since I last did an interview. So rusty. So practice. And the way I think you might do that is see if there are some friendly colleagues around that will be willing to sit down with you to just go through some questions. Some friendly consultants around that might be willing to do that. Look on the faculty's website and find out some interview questions that they've suggested. I certainly find it helpful to just collate a number of interview questions that others have been asked in their interviews, to use that to prepare. And then final thing I probably will say is prepare a compelling narrative. And we'll come back to that later on during the podcast. I'll stop there, Ellis. Thanks.
Great. There's some really good advice there, and I agree with everything you've just said. And just to add from an assessor's perspective, I think the point about that research before the interview is really, really key. I've sat on a lot of panels where people talk too generically. The people on those panels want to hear about you, your interest in that area. And there is so much information available online for people to access, but there is also the telephone. We can still pick up the telephone and speak to people as well, isn't it? So try and be really specific about the role and the employing organisation as well. My last point just is also about, think about the question you could be asked if you were successfully appointed to the post. What would be your PDP requirements? It's likely the faculty will ask this, and I think, you know, give that a little bit of thought, and again, make it specific to the role that you're applying for and the portfolio that you might be leading on as well. Thanks, Ellis.
Fatai mentioned preparing a compelling narrative. Could you expand on what is meant by that term, Anna?
Yes, thank you, Ellis. We all have a list of achievements and skills which we would want to mention in an ideal interview. A compelling narrative in this case is intended as an opportunity for the candidate to fluently and succinctly describe what they are most proud of, with particular focus on achievements and successes throughout their career. I would recommend to choose from accomplishments which have been objectively valued or that have made a difference. For example, a peer review article, a grant obtained, a paper published, a service implemented and which is still in operation. The candidate should be able to lucidly explain their contribution to the task in a structured way, providing a general definition first, followed by a detailed description of the facts and outcomes, always including lessons learned. The compelling narrative typically covers around 10 to 12 questions around specific areas, such as, for example, leadership, team working, partnership working, managing within resources, health inequalities, dealing with difficult colleagues, working in a political environment, and often inclusion and diversity amongst others. Usually these areas are listed in the job description, and this is why it is very important to read each part of the job description carefully. Thank you, Ellis. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Anna. So presumably it takes practice to be able to answer interview questions well and to remember to include your compelling narrative wherever it is relevant. What are your tips about answering questions?
Thank you, Ellis. And I think I'm hoping the listener will be able to get the emphasis we're given to practicing for the interview. Like anything else, it's a skill set that you have to develop. So practice is key in this. We've talked about finding some trusted colleagues that you can practice some question with. The other thing I'll probably add to that is think about how you can bring about some coherent structure to your response, because you can have a really good response that feels scattered all over the place and the audience, your panelists, are not able to follow your narrative. So think about how can you get your point across in 2, 3, 4 minutes at most to really get back to that. And it goes back to the point that Anna was making about that compelling narrative around looking through your portfolio, the work you've done, particularly in the latter stage of your training, or if you're already a consultant in your most recent post, and just think about across those work, what are your key contribution? And as Anna said, it may be, what was my leadership contribution in this space? What was my conflict resolution in this space? What did I do to bring about change in this place? And it may be that you have one example that covers multiple of those, but really putting some time together to think about that is really key. And particularly for registrars, it can be difficult sometimes when you have to prepare an answer that talks about the impact. We don't spend that long in a placement at times to be able to demonstrate that impact. But the panelists, they know that your AAC panel knows that. So actually what you might want to think about is, what did you do up to the point when you were in that post? What would you have done next if you had carried on being in that post? Because it allows them to show your impact and your intended impact, even though the time wasn't there. And it might even be useful to even share what you knew happened to your piece of work after you had left. I think that's incredibly, incredibly powerful around that. I think that probably gives some additional tips there. I will stop there in case there's anything else to be added in. I can see Aimee smiling on that.
I am, because it's really important, and I have sat on AACs where people have left a placement, but they actually know what has happened since, and it just shows that sort of commitment, that interest, and it shows you've really prepared for the interview as well. So I'm really pleased to hear you say that as well. So thank you for that. Just a couple of reflections, I suppose, from the assessor perspective. Anna mentioned it as well about preparing for a supplementary question around what you learned, so your reflections. So think of the STAR technique and that, what would you do differently? And I think as registrars or people who've come through the UK PHR route, it's a really good piece of advice to get into your preparations for interview. So what would you learn? What did you learn? What would you do differently? And how could you use that in a different setting maybe next time? There's also been a couple of references to structured frameworks. I just mentioned STAR very briefly, with the second R about the reflection side of things. That's a really good framework, I think, for those competency-based questions. But you will also have questions about, tell us about yourself. So the CAMP model is useful for that. So clinical, academic, management and personnel. So, have a look at those, see what feels right for you. And then I think Anna also mentioned there could be questions around conflict or problematic colleagues. So the SPIES framework here can be very useful as well. So look at some of those, and again, practice your answers as others have said. Saying things out loud is very different to having notes written down in front of you. So thank you, Ellis.
So some very useful tips, I think, there. So let's go back to clarifying the process. What are the component parts of the appointment process, and which ones are obligatory?
Okay, so we'll assume the person has applied for the job and they have been shortlisted for interview, and this will be an AAC panel. And this may be people's first AAC panel, so do look at the guidance online from the faculty around that to see who's likely to be on the panel. So the AAC panel is the essential part of the process, and you will always have a faculty assessor on that. Generally, the AAC panels are no more than an hour. They may be slightly longer, slightly less, just depends on the employer. And as part of that AAC panel, you'll have probably 5 or 6 people interviewing you, a range of questions, and it's your chance to shine, bring your application to life. It's very common for you to be asked to do a presentation as part of that AAC panel and deliver that. That could be a 5 or 10 minute presentation, sometimes with slides, sometimes without. And then I think the interview process it varies for AACs. Sometimes they're fully online, sometimes they're hybrid, sometimes they're in person. But again, if it is an online interview, do check your IT beforehand. It's incredibly frustrating for all if the IT doesn't work on the day. So that's the actual AAC interview, but there might be other parts of the process as well. So some employers like to do psychometric testing. Some people will use tests during the day if there's an interview process over the day. It could be a written test, preparing a press release, a statement in response to an outbreak or something. But also increasingly, I think there's stakeholder panels as well. So meeting people you will be working with within the team and with partners as well. And I think it's really important to remember that all of these are part of the process, even the less informal ones such as lunches. You are being considered as a potential future member of the team.
Thanks, Aimee. So you mentioned the presentation. What are your key tips for preparing for the presentation?
Thanks, Ellis. Yeah, I mean, presentation is one of those that receive mixed reactions. Some people love it, some people dread it. But it's become a common part of AAC interview where candidates are either given some question beforehand and asked to prepare a presentation, or given something on the day that they prepare just before the interview. They usually last about 10 minutes, some maybe longer, some maybe shorter. It's always worth reminding yourself, what is it that this exercise is testing? Because we might get lost in what it is that we're being asked to do without thinking about what is it that is objectively trying to assess. Generally, your presentation is testing your presentation skills, which essentially is how do you distill really complex information to something succinct within a given time period that you have. So it's testing your presentation skills, but it's also testing critically your ability to answer the question that's being asked. It's very tempting when given a topic to fly off on a completely different direction, but always think, am I answering the question that's being asked? And it's also an opportunity for you to demonstrate your understanding of the local demographics, your knowledge of the current position that the public health team are taking. What are their plans going forward? What approach would you take that would be slightly different from that? But be mindful that you also have to be realistic in this. It's easy to come in and suggest things that are just way out there. Are you showing some sense of pragmatism and realism in your answers? So it's testing your presentation skills. It's testing your ability to answer the question. It's also testing your ability to engage with the audience that you're sitting in front of you, and how you keep and grab hold of their attention and deliver the message in there. It's also testing your time management skills. So you can't let the time get away from you. You can't let it run. So what you might need to do is prepare and practice your response, making sure that it can be delivered within that time. Give yourself some breathing space as well, so that you're not rushing through your answers and you feel like you're just not taking a breath in that process. It's also worth practicing that in front of somebody, perhaps somebody who's not even in that space, who's not in the public health space, saying, do you understand what it is I'm saying? Am I getting information across? Because on your panel may very well be a lay member who's not living and breathing public health for every day of their working life. So practicing that, making sure that you can deliver it clearly at good speed, and you are engaging with the audience. Thank you.
Really good advice there. And I think there's a theme coming through: practice, practice, and practice, isn't it? But also, if you do that practice with people, do select people who are going to give you that honest feedback, I think, as well, isn't it? Not the people that are just going to say, yeah, that was great, and actually there was really some room for improvement. Just a couple of other pieces of advice from the assessor's perspective. If it's a 5-minute presentation, don't try and give us 10 slides in 5 minutes. It doesn't work. Presenting actually in the interview takes longer than you think. So really think about your time allocation per slide as well. Make sure we can read your slides, you know, how clear they are, the size of the fonts. Can they be quickly interpreted by people who, like Fatai said, who aren't necessarily public health professionals? And also think about, we don't want you to just stand up and read what's on your slides. It should be in addition to your slides and what you're saying. So don't read your notes. Have notes if you need notes, have them as an assurance and backup, but don't just stand up and read from those slides. And again, I think the last piece of advice is, this is really also an opportunity for you to demonstrate your research, your interest in this post. So give us some stats around the area, you know, demonstrate that research and local knowledge that you've done into the role and the organisation. Thanks, Ellis.
Thank you. So some good advice there, but unfortunately, some people are going to be unsuccessful at interview. So in those circumstances, what would you advise should be done?
Thank you, Ellis. Being unsuccessful at an interview can be particularly disappointing and even upsetting and frustrating. I've been through that, and I can tell it feels like a failure. But what I would say is that instead it can be seen as an opportunity to learn about yourself and about your performance as well. So my first advice would be to go and ask for feedback, both from the faculty or public health representative or assessor, and from the employer. In certain instances, the feedback from the employer could reveal that what the employer needed was simply someone more senior with a broader experience in a specific area, system change, design strategy, that as opposed to a newly qualified consultant. On the other hand, the faculty advisor will be able to provide constructive feedback, which is designed to help you succeed in a future job application. The faculty advisor would highlight experiences, knowledge, and skills that were considered fundamental for that specific job description, for that specific role, for a candidate to be considered appointable. So if unsuccessful, it is worth always reflecting on whether that job that the candidate applied for was the right one for the candidate at that moment in their career, or if instead it's worth exploring alternative options, alternative jobs and positions within public health, obviously. Remember, you cannot control how well others perform at an interview, but you can only try to give a good account of yourself.
Thanks, Anna. And if I may add to that as well, I think some really good tips there is, even if you're successful, I think there is something to be learned about what did you do well on and what did you do not so well on. So I'm certainly a big fan, even when I was offered my post, in asking the faculty assessor or the faculty advisor to say, what was it that I did well? What was the tipping over point that made me the successful candidate? And what areas, even though I was successful overall, what areas could I have worked on better? And I think this has two roles in doing this. One is, it's a learning nature, isn't it? You're continually improving, so you're learning in that process. But the second is, this may be the last feedback you get about your interview before your next interview. So actually, don't waste the opportunity to learn what went well and what didn't go so well for your future development. Thank you, Ellis.
Thank you very much. So thank you, colleagues, for all that you've said. I hope that it's proven valuable to the listeners. Clearly, we all hope that you found this podcast helpful, and we wish you good luck in your future careers.